Mama.
Okay, I hope everybody can hear me. I'm just letting everybody in. I think we'll just start in a few once we have everybody.
Poneme papel, poneme Pokémon en tu móvil.
Okay, guys, just wait for one more minute and then we'll basically start. I'm going to make sure I have the right screen that I'm sharing with you. Okay. Okay. I am going to put this on the side. Okay. Oh, I say Felix is here. Good to see you, Felix. All right. Okay.
Hi, David.
Hey, Felix, how you doing?
Fine, yeah.
Good, not too bad. Just making sure all this goes okay. All right, let me go all the way back to the beginning of this. Okay. All right, I think I'm gonna go ahead and start. If you have questions in the middle, I'm not going to be checking the chat until the very, very end. So if you have a question, just feel free to unmute yourself and then just ask me. And then I'll address questions essentially as we go. I'm still going to be, I think, letting people in over the next couple of minutes. So it might be a little bit choppy at the beginning, but hopefully it'll get smoother as we go. I'll try to recap a little bit. Obviously, I know a lot of the people were not there for the first 2 lectures, and it's not at all required in any sense. But just to give you a sense of, you know, how I envisioned thinking about the pandemic philosophically, and what it says essentially about some of the biggest questions essentially facing us in the world today, right? So I'm going to go ahead and start. And this is, as you know, this is the last and third lecture of philosophy and the pandemic. And today we're going to talk about, and here's Regina. Today we're going to talk about the work of Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish thinker, a 20th century thinker, one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, one of the greatest women philosophers probably ever. And really one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, regardless of gender or sex. One of my favorite thinkers. And we're gonna be focusing on her critique of the idea of human rights. So I will read it. Today, we are going to focus on the work of Hannah Arendt and the way in which the pandemic can serve to highlight her critique of the way we think about rights. And as I'll explain, and I hope most people will immediately simply agree, that the dominant conception of rights today is the idea of universal human rights, that we all fundamentally, by virtue simply of being human beings, share certain fundamental rights. Now, to recap a little bit, I started this series by talking about risks, because obviously that's the issue that is so immediately present in the context of a pandemic. The fears that we all face from getting infected, the risks that come from then dealing with the virus and shutting down, things that we're continuing essentially live today. And we talked about the work of a German sociologist, Ulrich Beck, and his idea that today we actually live in a risk society, because he argues everything in our society is actually focused on the fears of what could go wrong and on assessing, calculating risks, and so ultimately on distributing risks and fears in society, deciding who it is and how it is that different people will actually be exposed to risks. And in that first lecture, relying on Beck's work, I argued that the focus that thinking constantly about risks puts on trying to normalize things and stabilize things, and our individual attempts to deal with our fears very often in individual ways through the things that we buy, for example, that this actually could lead to exacerbating the risks that we face rather than dealing with them, since that is the dominant way in which we try to deal with them, by trying to normalize them, by trying to distribute them away essentially from ourselves, so that at least we individually don't have to face them, right? In the second, we focused on another issue which has been very, very present for people who've been cooped up in their homes, which is a question of what is it actually to live the good life? as we've been thrown out of our normal ways of doing things, many people have been struck with this question of what am I doing in my life? What is the meaning of it all? And in the second lecture, we focused on the work of an American philosopher, Michael Sandel, who basically talks about the growing tendency over the last decades for people to think of goods and the good life increasingly in economic and in commercial terms. The idea being that the more we can actually bring more and more goods within the marketplace, we'll all end up with more and more of what it is that we want. And we focused on our experience of the pandemic to say, well, goods like health, for example, in the context of the pandemic, have made it clear that thinking simply in economic and commercial terms about goods and the good life could end up giving us less of the things that we actually care about the most, could lead to the degradation of some of the things that we care about the most. And so both Beck and Sandel, you could say, in some ways, focus on things that we usually deal with in individual ways, happiness, fears, and they try to make a broader argument about how we should think in more social and communal terms about what the fundamental goods are, how we actually define risks, and that doing that will actually allow us not simply to try to normalize things, which will actually make us deal with more exacerbated risks, but rather actually come together and realize that we live in a world of shared risks, and that goods can't just be defined on individual terms by putting a price on them. They have to be defined in communal terms. So there was a link in some ways when we talked about risks and goods through Beck and Sandel. Today, we're going to focus on another issue, which to me is actually probably the most fundamental one, which is rights, and what the experience of the pandemic has shown us about what rights are, how they actually function. And I think this one not only illuminates the pandemic, not only illuminates, like in the case of risks and goods, where we are, but in the case of rights, so many people who probably have taken the rights that they have for granted, this is probably for many people around the world the first time that they've had a sense of what it is actually to have certain rights and to exercise them. When people have lost or have had at least suspended some fundamental rights, like the right to free movement, the right in many countries of peaceful assembly, for example, right? This has been one of the most contentious aspects of the lockdown in the pandemic, and it continues to worry so many people. And so in some ways today, we're going to go in the opposite direction. In the case of risks and goods, we started with individuals and thought about more communal and social ways of thinking about risks and goods. And rights are obviously social and political. They're an aspect of our social and political order. But in the context of the pandemic, we've seen essentially so many of those rights restricted to the point of people being physically isolated from each other. So we're going to use the experience that so many people have had of suspending, restricting in most contexts. In some contexts, there's the argument that the pandemic has been used actually to take away rights from people. Hopefully in our context, it's simply a question of suspension. But this experience of actually losing the experience of rights that you've actually had, I hope can allow us to talk about what are actually rights. How do they actually function? To do that, we're gonna talk about the idea of universal human rights. This is a map essentially of the world. You'll see as the talk continues why a world of the United Nations could in some ways be crucial essentially to the talk today and the idea of universal human rights. But living in a global world, it almost seems to make sense that we increasingly think about rights in human terms, that we think of them in global terms. The very idea of universal human rights, and we're going to talk about this, I'm going to talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations, that happens at the end of the Second World War, right? But the very idea of universal human rights presumes that we have these rights simply by virtue of being human beings, right? It doesn't matter what community we belong to. It doesn't matter what nation we belong to. It doesn't matter what our sex or our race is. We have human rights simply by virtue of being human beings, right? This is what Hannah Arendt is going to help us think about, this idea of rights that increasingly has become the dominant way of thinking about rights, even as we in the pandemic have become more and more conscious, and I'm gonna talk about this near the end of the talk, of how important actually our citizenship is, how important our community belonging is, because that's determined very often who can be where you can travel, where you can travel, where you can't. This is still essentially the experience that we have today, a world that increasingly seems more and more global, with people being able to move wherever it is that they wanted to. The pandemic has made us very, very conscious actually of how we are defined politically, and the rights that go with those kinds of political definitions. But first, I want to start talking about this idea that, as I'm saying, is increasingly the dominant way of thinking about rights all around the world, the idea of universal human rights. What is implied essentially in thinking about rights in this way, in thinking about rights in universal and human terms? And why is it that somebody like Hannah Arendt, you see her here, this is her in one of her many smoking pictures, and why would somebody like her, and if you don't know anything about her life, this is somebody who experienced the Holocaust. She was a refugee. She escaped the concentration camp in France and went to the United States. Usually when we talk about how important universal human rights are, we're thinking essentially of people like Hannah Arendt, right? People who may not have any other kind of protection, but the protection that presumably should come with rights that we all have simply by being human beings. And yet she has provided probably the most important critique of the idea of universal human rights. She argues that this is actually a wrong way of thinking about rights, a dangerous way of thinking about rights. And so I'm going to take you through her argument. But before we do that, I want to talk about how this vision of rights has become actually the dominant way of thinking about rights around the world. Many people, some people still talk about, well, this idea that there are universal human rights. This is actually a Western and a European idea that has been imposed on people all around the world, whose culture may be very, very different, but Europeans, by saying that these are universal rights, basically said, we have the right to come into your countries and to tell you how you should live your lives, because this is actually what makes everybody human. You still hear this critique, But the interesting thing for me, especially teaching at a university like IE and having such an international body of students, is to see how so many people coming from so many different cultural backgrounds are committed increasingly to this vision of rights, that rights are actually universal and human. I have a lot of examples of this, but it's really always struck me that even people who are very, very cynical about a lot of other things, when I ask in my classes who believes in the idea of universal human rights, almost always more than 90% of people raise their hands and say that they believe in the idea of universal human rights. I have other examples. One of my favorite examples is in the United States, the State Department does a human rights report on every country in the world every year, essentially. You can go to the website of the US State Department and you can read their human rights report. And as you can imagine, every year, many countries like Russia and Cuba and North Korea and China have very long dossiers of all of their human rights violations as set out by the US State Department. But in the last couple of decades, the Chinese, for example, the Chinese government now every year does a human rights report on the US, talking about all of the human rights violations committed actually by the US. Over the last few weeks, we've been privy to the human rights violations that American society is in fact quite capable of. But what this shows you is that you could be cynical about this in some ways and say, look at how everybody basically uses this as a kind of political football to accuse others of not actually standing up for the ideals that they supposedly believe in. But the other way of thinking about this is the fact that everybody uses this language now, the idea of universal human rights, just shows that this has become really the dominant way that we think about rights around the world today. I'm gonna show you, I'm gonna share with you a screen of the Universal Declaration. This is the Universal Declaration, essentially, which was signed in 1948 as the United Nations itself came into being. And we're not going to go through all of this. I do this in my classes. But the way that the Universal Declaration is set up is basically to say, look, after the experience of the Second World War, we know what can go wrong when we don't think about rights in human and in universal terms. And now we've come together as all of the nations of the world, and we've committed ourselves to this ideal of what it is fundamentally to be human, right? These are rights that define our humanity and our shared dignity. And that's where the Universal Declaration begins in Article 1. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And in the second article, you see exactly what it means, that this is something, these are rights that define our humanity and that we share simply by virtue of being human beings. Because as it says, these rights and freedoms are given to people without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status, right? So this is saying that even if you were an individual at any time in human history, anywhere in the world, simply by virtue of being a human being, you actually have these rights. Now, when I usually ask people, like I said, most people today immediately agree that we should think about our rights in universal and human terms. But when I go through this document with students and we look at the whole article, and especially as we get to some of the later rights, which are positive social rights, rights like Article 23, everyone has a right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Everyone has a right to equal pay for equal work. Article 24 is actually the right to vacations. Article 25, everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services. And the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control, right? When we go through all of these, many of the students who say, yes, I fundamentally believe in this, one of the most important historians working today who's written on the idea of universal human rights, his name is Samuel Moyn, and he calls it the last utopia, meaning this is kind of the last good story that everybody believes in, the idea that we have these universal human rights. But like I said, as we go through this in my classes, many of my students say, yes, I very much believe in the idea of universal human rights. And then with a great deal of anger, many students talk about how this is all just theoretical. It sounds so good, but so few people actually exercise all of the rights around the world that are defined as being universal and human. So the fundamental question very often that faces us with the question of universal human rights is, yes, we all have these rights, but how do we actually make them real? How do we actually exercise all of these rights? The people who came up with this idea of rights in the European Enlightenment, right? They were aware that very few people actually exercised them or had them. If you go and read the articles of the Universal Declaration, if we go back 300 years ago, there's probably nowhere in the world where anybody exercised the vast majority of these rights. But their argument was that this is actually what defines our humanity. So that the more we think in these terms about rights, the more we think in human terms about rights, the more our human development, the more our human destiny will be defined essentially by these rights. And this is how we continue to think about these rights. We think about how it's only, for example, the developed part of the world that has all of the democratic and civil rights that are set out so clearly in the Universal Declaration. And so the vision of how it is that these rights are supposed to become truly universal and exercised by everybody is that the more we develop over time, yes, certain countries may be poor and may not have the capacity to provide healthcare for all of their people. But their goal is that the more we develop, the more essentially these rights will become something that will be exercised by everybody in the world. So the idea of universal human rights implies within it a conception ultimately of human development, of common human progress towards the realization of rights that fundamentally make us all human beings, right? So this gives you a little bit of a background on the idea of universal human rights. And what we're gonna do is I'm gonna go back to my presentation, if I can find it. Yeah. Right. And like I said, I want to talk about why does Arendt think that this is the wrong way of thinking about rights. I just talked about the idea of universal human rights and human development. So I'm going to take you through her overall argument about first, how did universal human rights come into being? Very often today, people take this idea and they almost dehistoricize it, meaning they somehow think that this idea in some ways has always been there. The very idea of universal human rights presumes that. It says that everybody, by virtue of being human beings, has always had these rights, right? And so very often telling the history of universal human rights becomes about telling a story about, oh, okay, here in this country, for example, they started to actually respect this right. And so we celebrate the recognition essentially of this right at some point in history. And so we tell this kind of, as it's known in historiography, this Whig history, meaning we look at the things that we love about ourselves and we look backward in history and we try to find who was the first essentially actually to realize what it is that we love about ourselves. How did we become the wonderful people that we actually are? This is very often the way that the history of universal human rights is told. I'll give you an example. Since I'm from an Iranian background, many people, many Iranian intellectuals have tried to make the argument that the first Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great, that we should see Cyrus the Great as a kind of pioneer of the idea of human rights. Why? Because when he conquered his whole empire, in the different areas of the empire that he went to, he said, you can basically continue to practice your own customs, and I will not essentially impose myself and my way of doing things on you. I will respect your traditions, your customs. And so this is said to be, oh, look, this is a beginning of universal human rights. The reality, looking at it historically, is this is how empires usually worked in history. They usually left people in local areas alone to do their own things as long as they paid taxes. And in fact, if somebody, for example, were to come and invade Spain today and say, well, I've taken you over, but I'll let you have your own customs and traditions, people would not see this as somehow a reflection of human rights in any sense. But it gives you a way in which, a way of understanding how we have taken this idea of universal human rights and we've tried to project it backward in history to see who has actually anticipated the things that we value in terms of what are called universal human rights. What Hannah Arendt does is to go in the exact opposite direction. She tries to show what was the world like before people thought of rights in universal human terms. Because I can tell you as a historian, and this is going to be a large part of my presentation, sorry, this is a relatively historically new way of thinking about rights. And what Hannah Arendt does, and you'll see why this is crucial to her overall argument about what's wrong about thinking about rights in universal and human terms, is she focuses on what is supposed to be irrelevant to the rights that we have as human beings. She focuses on people's social identities, their political identities, and how these have shifted over the course of history to explain both what were rights like before people thought of them in universal human terms, to explain where they actually came from. How did people start thinking about rights as being universal and human? And then to discuss, and this is her argument, what she does is she takes one of the basic stories of human development that were supposed to make human rights real ultimately for everybody. And she tries to show how this story of how human development will give us rights, how this story actually goes wrong. why it actually ends up with something that is more of a nightmare in terms of rights, the situation of people like her who ended up being stateless refugees, rather than actually a way in which rights became something universally exercised for everybody in the world. And that leads her to an alternative political conception of rights that we'll come to essentially at the end of the talk. So I want to explain essentially her point of view by talking about how did human societies conceive of identity and rights before the modern world, which for our purposes, we're going to put in the European Enlightenment and in the French Revolution. And I'll explain very clearly how the way in which we experience these human rights as being the basis of politics in the modern world, how that comes in actually in the French Revolution. So we're talking about something, the French Revolution breaks out in 1789. We're talking about something that is very recent in human history, just a little more than 2 centuries, right? And we're going to talk about especially how national identity, since I said the world of the United Nations is the one in which human rights becomes the dominant way of thinking about rights. We're going to talk about how it's actually the birth of the idea of the nation state, of these identities we have of actually being members of a nation, of a people, how this is at the starting point of thinking about rights in universal human terms. So how did people think about rights before they started to think about them in universal human terms? Give me 1 second. Let me just get a. So, for most of human history, for most of recorded human civilization, meaning that we have records essentially of societies, which happen in the context when human beings move from being hunter-gatherer groups and settled down into agricultural civilizations, right? For most of recorded human history, societies were fundamentally hierarchically ordered, right? So if we take the example of European societies in the medieval world, and this is just an example because you could take this example and you could apply it essentially across the world until the modern period, you would see that almost all agricultural societies are very, very hierarchical. They are made up of a group of estates, right? Classes that are hierarchically ordered. And each group basically has a task in society. Like I said, they are hierarchically ordered. So in the context of the medieval European world, these estates were at the very, very top were the clergy. And then in the second estate, they were the aristocracy. The clergy obviously spoke for God. As I'll explain, these were almost all these civilizations were religiously based civilizations in one sense or another, right? At the very top, usually in most contexts, were somebody who talked for some kind of a divine, cosmological, religious tradition and explained how the world actually worked, what different people in it were like, what their special role was, right? And that's why the people at the top were the people who had that story, the clergy in the case of medieval Europe. In the second place were the aristocracy. These were the people who in the medieval world had the monopoly on arms. They were the ones who fought, right? And then there was a third group called the bourgeoisie. These were the people who lived in the towns and usually practiced professions like the people who made houses and shoes and professors and lawyers and doctors. And then at the bottom of the society were the peasants. And in all agricultural societies around the world, more than 80% of the population were always peasants, right? Most of the effort of society in terms of what most of the people in it did was simply to try to produce enough food for everybody else in the society, right? Now, how were rights conceived of in these very hierarchical societies? They certainly were not thought of in universal and human terms, because if you were a peasant, you certainly did not have the same rights as a member of the aristocracy. You didn't have the same rights as a member of the clergy. Rights in the pre-modern world were not what people had in common. It's not what they shared as human beings. Rights were privileges. Rights were what set you apart from everybody else. It was a privilege that you had that allowed you to do something that nobody else in the society could do. So in the case of the aristocracy, like I said, they had the monopoly on arms. They were the only ones who actually could fight in the society, right? In the case of the people in the towns who practiced all of those professions, usually these people were members of guilds, organizations. So for example, if you were a stonemason, somebody who built houses, that was a special right that you had. Nobody else could do that without actually the agreement of all of the stonemasons. Nobody had the right actually to do that. It's not like our market system where anybody who thinks that they might produce something that others may buy may practice whatever profession it is that they would want to, right? So rights were determined essentially by people's classes and by the special roles that they played in society, roles that were generally not freely chosen, but were usually explained as this is what you're meant to do because this is God's vision for society and what the different people in it are and what they are meant actually to do. And this is where, so rights were defined hierarchically, according usually to the different specialization of labor in society, which was fixed. And they were generally explained in a religious way. This is also why the basis of politics until the modern world generally were these religious visions of how the world actually was ordered. This is what justified the state to implement these social hierarchies. And this is why so much of the world before the modern world was composed of empires, because in the name actually of spreading the message of God, states basically could try to expand themselves indefinitely. And they didn't go and try to transform the people that they actually found there. They simply used the idea that we are Christians, for example, and the right thing to do is to spread Christianity all around the world. But another way then in which rights were defined was through religion. So if you were a Jewish person, for example, in the medieval European world, you were essentially an outsider in society. You had very different rights than everybody else because you were Jewish and you were not Christian. The best you could hope for would be some kind of toleration. In the Islamic world, Jews and Christians had an accepted place in society. They were allowed to practice their own religion. They were protected, right? But they had different restrictions and obligations. They were not like everybody else. They had special obligations, like at least in Islamic law, they were supposed to wear, this very often didn't happen, but they were supposed to wear identifying clothing, showing that they are actually Christian and Jewish, right? So again, you see in the pre-modern world, people did not define rights in human terms. they were defined in terms of people's identity, which was usually in terms of their social identity within classes, or their religious identity that separated them off from everybody else who had actually a different religion, right? Okay, so the next part of the story has to do with how does all of this actually change? How do we come into a world in which we come to define rights fundamentally in universal human terms, right? And where human rights, as opposed to religion and religious commitments, start to become the basis, the legitimate basis of politics and what politics is fundamentally supposed to be about, right? The story, as I've already hinted, has to do with the rise of the nation state, the rise of national identity. In the 19th century, many people, just as I was saying about human rights and people tending to take this idea and to push it backwards in history as having always been there, people did the same thing with the idea of national identity, right? They somehow presume that there have always been French people and Turks and Italians and Arabs, and right, and it was only a question of time until these different peoples became conscious of themselves and decided actually to determine their own fate. The reality, though, is that this way of thinking about identity, national identity, is as recent as the idea of universal human rights. And the two actually have gone hand in hand. It's when people start thinking about their identity fundamentally first in national terms, rather than what group of society they belong to or what their religion is, it's at that same moment that then they try to base this national identity on the idea of universal human rights. I'm going to explain this in more detail for you, but like I said, if we go back and go, for example, to the French kingdom in 1500, and we imagine somebody living in Paris, or somebody living in a village somewhere in one of the different provinces in France. And we went and asked that person, tell us about yourself. Who are you, right? Explain your identity. That person might have said a lot of different things. If they practice some profession in a town, that would have been very high up in how, that would probably have been very high up in how they would have described themselves. They would have probably described the local area that they come from. If they were a peasant, living on the land of some member of the aristocracy, they would have probably talked about their lord. So they might have talked about their profession, their family, their locality. They might have gone very, very large and talked about their Christian identity, that's who they fundamentally were. The last thing that peasant or that stonemason in France in 1500 would have said is, I'm French. It simply would not have happened, right? That was not a way of thinking about identity in the pre-modern world. And the way you can understand it very easily is by thinking about the aristocracy who actually, and the clergy that actually ruled so many of the places around the European continent, and different classes of the same type ruling essentially all around the world in the pre-modern context. Those people would have never identified themselves with the people that they ruled, right? The aristocracy were generally an international class of people in Europe. They married each other and they fought each other, right? But they would have never thought, I have the same identity with that peasant. Very, very often, the people, the aristocrats who ruled any area came from a very different area of, they spoke different languages, they had a completely different cultural affiliations. many of you here in Spain will know Charles the First of Spain, who was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who comes here and is part of the Habsburg dynasty after Spain actually becomes a united kingdom, right? Where is he from? He's not Spanish. He's from Flanders. He has to learn Spanish, and he certainly, again, would have never identified himself. He would have identified himself with his dynasty and the international class of people, aristocrats that he dealt with, but certainly not with the people that he ruled over here within the Spanish kingdom. And if you go even into the First World War, for example, and we look at the actors in the First World War, George V of Britain, for example, of the British Empire, and Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, Wilhelm II, who's the Kaiser of Germany, right? These are all imperial titles. What is their relationship to each other? They're first cousins. They're basically family, right? The aristocracy do not identify with the people that they rule over. And that is why this idea of fundamentally, this is what goes together with national identity. The idea is it's an egalitarian identity. It doesn't matter what my job is, how much money I make. Fundamentally, if I'm a French citizen, I'm French. And that makes me French like all other French citizens, right? This is an egalitarian notion of identity, which only really emerges in the context of the French Revolution, which is the same moment in which all of those different hierarchical estates in society essentially break down. And the idea emerges of popular sovereignty, of national sovereignty. We, the people, meaning all of us equally, have the right to rule ourselves. The people are sovereign, right? And when that idea emerges, it comes to be based on the idea of the rights of man. We, the people, have the right to rule ourselves. We're all equal because fundamentally that is a right that we have as human beings. So I'm going to share with you another, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Let me see if I can do this. Yeah, I think it's there. Okay, I hope you can see it, right? And we're not going to go through all of it, but I showed you the Universal Declaration, and this is the great representative of this idea of, I think I lost somebody who's there. So this is in the French Revolution, where really, as historians discuss, this is the first time when we get a nation state, right? The people saying that we are the ones who are sovereign. We're all equal. We have the same identity. And the way in which that is justified is on the basis of universal human rights, the rights of man, right? So this is called the rights of man and the citizen. And the rights of man are used to define what it is to be a citizen of France, what it is actually to be French. Article 1, you see it says, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. This says it doesn't, there's nothing fundamental about the different roles that people play in society, whether they're stonemasons or professors or doctors, right? Those distinctions are only based on what would be good for everybody. So if somebody may be born into a family of doctors, but you know, they are much better at physics, so it's best for society if that person becomes a physicist and doesn't become a doctor like the rest of his family, right? Social distinctions are irrelevant to citizenship. They only matter to the extent that they actually allow for the general good for everybody in society. 2, the aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. You see here, the basis of all politics is the rights of man. Human rights are the basis of politics. They are what actually define citizenship. And most importantly, number 3, that says the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. Nobody nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. So the people have the right to rule themselves. There's no fundamental distinction between them except for what would be good for the general good of society as a whole, right? And it's on the basis of our human rights then that citizenship is defined. And this means that all around the world, right? This is the story. Remember I said how human rights ultimately always have a story about how our human development over time will actually make these rights real for everybody. And this declaration of the rights of man and the citizen has precisely that kind of story within it. The story is, to the extent that the people come to get rid of the foreigners who are oppressing them, and in the French Revolution and ever since then, the aristocracy were seen as foreigners. They're not really French. They divide themselves from the rest of the people. To the extent that people come actually to rule themselves, to the extent that they come to actually create a nation state, a sovereign people, to that extent, they will be able to realize the rights that belong to all human beings through citizenship for their own citizens, right? So this is the story of human development, that through citizenship, human rights is the basis of citizenship, and through citizenship, national identity, the rights of man become a reality increasingly for everybody in the world. So that is what the world of the United Nations is actually supposed to be about, right? Each nation, even if it may have been under the thumb of some foreign rulers, which, as we'll discuss, happened in the age of European imperialism, to the extent that it's able to free itself to become actually a nation, it realizes human rights ultimately for everybody in the society. Let me go back to my presentation. So here I have, say, the case of the Jews, right? As I've been trying to explain, this idea of national identity as this egalitarian identity that we all share, that is based on the idea actually of human rights. This is why they go hand in hand and come into history together. This idea actually allowed for the creation of this new kind of identity, this new kind of social and political identity, namely national identity. You have to imagine a world in which, for example, in France at the time of the French Revolution, you had so many different groups of people, the Bretons and the people in Provence, and who really, even when they spoke French spoke very, very different dialects, had different customs, had different traditions, right? In the case of Jews, religious outsiders to society, what the idea of citizenship based on human rights made possible is that through citizenship, something like a common national identity actually was created. People who were very, very different from each other, through the rights and obligations of citizenship, were brought into the same identity. So after the French Revolution, in the process of the French Revolution, Jews stopped being seen as Jews in the sense of these are the outsiders of Christian society. Religion is said to be simply their own private identity. That's one of the rights of man. Everybody should be able to choose their own religious identity and opinion. But they were fundamentally citizens of France, right? So they are integrated through citizenship into a common French cultural and political identity. So in a way, what we think of today as, oh, this is French, or this is the French language, or this is French culture, this is something that was really created through this process of integration in the 19th century. As very often, people who were very, very different from each other were actually educated through state schools in the same culture and the same language, and they started to now look more and more like each other, whereas before they had been very, very different from each other. And even though in the 19th century, most European statesmen had this idea that national identity was somehow something natural that had always been there, they were very conscious that they were actually, in a way, creating a French people that had not existed beforehand. This is especially clear in the case of Italian unification, which happens quite late in European history. And one of the architects of Italian unification very famously says, when the first kingdom of Italy is created, he says, we have created Italy, now we have to create some Italians, right? Meaning we have to get all of these people who can barely understand each other because they're speaking all of these different dialects. We actually have to create this common egalitarian identity. And that's what citizenship based on the idea of human rights allowed for in the context of the 19th century. Now, we're gonna shift to Hannah Arendt's critique of what becomes the idea of universal human rights by basically adding another step in the story of identity, of what happens to identity over time, what happens to national identity over time, right? There's a presumption, like I said, that these identities have always been there, and it was only a question of people becoming conscious of them. But the reality is that national identity itself was something relatively new, and it didn't stay stable. It actually changed radically over the course of the 19th century. And this is the story that Hannah Arendt is following here. Just to give you a sense, even today in our own world, we know that the character of national identity is not simply stable, that it's something that's actually changing under our feet, right? Today, for example, I think IE University, where we are, is a perfect example of the shift that is happening. We're essentially in a global university where we have people coming from all over the world, and the language that is the dominant language of instruction in our university is English, even though we are here in Spain. But 50 years ago, universities were fundamentally seen as the creators of national culture. They would take whatever was happening all around the world, scientifically, culturally, and they would create a kind of national version of it. And now we're in a world in which we're essentially living in not only a global world, but we have increasingly global institutions like our own university. We have so many people who increasingly define themselves in very hybrid ways. I have so many students who, when I ask, you know, tell me about your background, they say, I'm Brazilian French, I'm this, right? There is the European Union, which is a supranational, essentially, identity. Many people elsewhere in the world increasingly no longer simply think in national terms, but in supranational terms, whether because they identify, let's say, with other Muslims in the Islamic world, right? We live in a world in which national identity as the basis of the political and economic world no longer is what it was 50 years ago. What Hannah Arendt does is to tell the story of how this identity actually is also radically shifting in the course of the 19th century. I'm going to explain this briefly by talking about the shift in the character of national identity and belonging in the European age of empire. And I'm going to show you a map so you can see. This is a map of the world in 1900. If you look at this map, you see that so much of it is colored light green. And this is the British Empire, the largest empire in world history. You can see why they said the sun never sets on the British Empire, right? And at its height, the British Empire encompassed about a fourth of the world's space, about a fourth of the world's people. If you counted all of the different peoples who were actually in their economic activity, kind of satellites of the British Empire, most of the people in South America were informally part of this British Empire. You could say about a third of the world's people, their fate, what happened to them, was dependent on what happened in the United Kingdom. But that's not the only case. You see the light purple here in the map. That's the French Empire. Then Libya here, that color you see is the same color as Italy. That is the Italian Empire. Indonesia belonged to the Dutch. This dark red here, this is the German Empire. And this map only even tells half the story, because these areas like China and the Ottoman Empire and Persia and Afghanistan, these places were also dominated essentially by Europeans in the course of the 19th century. And the only reason they maintained their independence was because the Europeans couldn't quite agree on how they would divide it up between themselves. Now, this is a world a few generations essentially after the creation of the nation state, of the French nation state, where increasingly many other countries in Europe are starting to think of themselves in terms of nationality and nation state. But the Europeans have gone on the basis of their own industrialization. They've gone and taken over so much of the rest of the world. Now think about it. If you are somebody in India that is part of the British Empire, or you're in West Africa in the French Empire, are you a British citizen or are you a French citizen? You're not. In fact, in all of these imperial contexts, the people in the colonies basically had different laws that applied to them. They did not have the same identity as the people in the mother country, in the metropole. They were not citizens. So you can think about it, at a time where initially being a national was fundamentally defined through citizenship, through the course of the 19th century, increasingly national identity comes to be based on ethnicity. It comes to be based on race. What makes me British? Why is it that the person in India is not a British citizen, but I am? Well, because I'm white and that person is not, right? So this is the shift, you know, that Hannah Arendt is talking about, how over the course of the 19th century, increasingly this identity that had been based on common citizenship defined through the rights of man, increasingly becomes something racial, ethnic, and so in that sense, exclusive, right? Because when you say, I am white and that person is not, you're basically saying that they cannot become British, right? Simply by following the same rules and obligations of citizenship that other British citizens would have to follow. Imperialism is one aspect of this story. Another aspect of this story is actually globalization. The fact that, we think of globalization as defining our world, but in some ways, the end of the 19th century was even more global than ours, because for the first time in human history, a real global market had been created, and there was much more free migration of labor by the end of the 19th century. So you had many peoples moving all around, but that led to the kind of nationalism which we are still familiar with. A group of strangers come into a country, people resent that kind of competition, and so they say, you don't belong here, these jobs belong to us, you're coming and you're taking away what belongs to us, right? So nationalism itself, which in the context of the French Revolution was something on the left, right? It was against the aristocracy, it was about patriotism. By the end of the 19th century, increasingly migrates to the right. It becomes about who are the right kind of people and who are the wrong kind of people, who should be in our country and who should not be in our country. That's why I want to give you the case of, we followed the case of the Jews when I said how they were integrated on the basis of citizenship into nation states. They became French citizens. But by the end of the 19th century, you see how national identity has shifted by looking at the case of the Jews and seeing the rise of anti-Semitism across Europe, right? Anti-Semitism, this was now not prejudice against Jews because they have a different religion, because they're Christian. It's saying the Jews constitute a separate race. They have different blood than everybody else in their countries. It doesn't matter if you speak perfect French or you speak perfect German or you're like everybody else, you love German culture. If you're a Jew, fundamentally, racially, you're different. You'll never be German. You're the wrong kind of person in Germany because racially and ethnically, you don't actually belong, right? Okay, so now we're at the point where we can get to the heart of Hannah Arendt's critique of the idea of universal human rights. I've talked about fundamentally this shift in identity, in national identity that happens by the end of the 19th century. And what Hannah Arendt does is follow up the results of this once the imperial rivalry between all of the European powers leads to the First World War, to the Great War between the European powers that becomes, you saw that map, inherently it was bound to become a global conflict, a world war, right? In the aftermath of the First World War, Hannah Arendt argues we could already see that actually the idea of the nation state as based on citizenship and as based on human rights was essentially crumbling. It was coming to an end, right? And she makes this case, she tells this story about, she calls it the decline of the nation state and the end of the rights of man. She does this by talking about the situation of groups of people who were designated as minorities and who were given special rights after the First World War. Let me show you a map. This is a map, we'll come back to that map in a second, but this is a map of Europe. This is a map of Europe after the First World War, right? This is a map of Europe before the First World War. If you look at the map of Europe before the First World War, you see we have some nation states like the British Kingdom, France, Spain, Portugal, the German Empire, right? Even though these countries have had, in a sense, Italy, generations to try to bring people who are quite different from each other into the same identity. Even to this day, everybody to some extent should be aware that these national identities are composite identities, right? There's still in Spain people who say, I am not Spanish, I'm Catalan, right? Who want to separate away and to have their own independence. So all of these national identities were created identities, but they had generations in a way to try to bring people into the same identity. Now, look at the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, if you think about it in national terms, it sounds, well, it's a union of Austrians and Hungarians, but that's actually the least of it, because the Austro-Hungarian starts out as the Habsburg Empire. Remember, I talked about Charles V. So it's a dynastic name, has nothing to do with nationality. Then it becomes the Austrian Empire. Then when it's clear that so many of the different nationalities within the empire want actually their own independence, there's a decision to try to bring the other largest nationality in the empire, the Hungarians, into the empire to try to create some kind of stability in an empire that, if you actually go and you look at it, has more than 11 different nationalities in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there are Czechs and Slovaks and Serbians and Croats and Slovenians and Bosnians and Poles and Italians, right? As well as Germans, who are the Austrians and Hungarians. There are Ruthenians, which was a name for Ukrainians in the 19th century, right? Go to the Ottoman Empire, again, another multinational empire made of Turks and Armenians and Arabs and Kurds. The Russian Empire, made up of many different Central Asian and Slavic groups of people, all within the same imperial background. Now, in the First World War, all of these multinational empires actually collapse. And this is the map of Europe after the First World War. And if you look at it, it seems like we now have a world essentially of nation states in Western Europe. Russia has become the Soviet Union, which is a union of Soviet socialist republics. Each socialist republic is thought of as being a kind of national republic that has joined a larger Soviet republic. But all across Europe, now you have Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, right? You have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic republics. So it seems like the story of development that we started talking about in the context of the French Revolution, that this was actually happening, right? This was coming to pass. We're starting to get nation states, and as people come to rule themselves, then they can essentially have human rights. What Hannah Arendt does is to show how actually already by this time, you could see that the story of the nation state and national liberation as actually making human rights universal and real for everybody, how this whole story had completely failed and was breaking down. And she does that by talking about a group of people that I already referred to, the minorities. Because in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the Ottoman Empire, in the Russian Empire, all of the different national groups that I referred to, it's not like they lived in different areas of the empire. They were all mixed together, right? So when you try to create in Eastern Europe new nation states, what happened was that you had very, very large minority groups from other nationalities within those nation states. So if we take the case of Poland, in Poland, there were only about 60% of people who were Polish. Then there were very large numbers of different nationalities, Germans, Jews, who were not seen quite as being Polish. In Czechoslovakia, after the First World War, has about 14 million, a little more than 14 million people in it. About half of them are Czechs, who are the dominant nationality in Czechoslovakia. But what is the second greatest national group in Czechoslovakia? You would assume that it's the Slovaks. But actually, Slovaks make up 3.3 million people in Czechoslovakia, whereas the Germans are 3.3 million people in Czechoslovakia. So the second largest nationality in Czechoslovakia, and they live right on the border with Germany in what is called the Sudetenland, right? They don't even have their name on the country. And in fact, when Hitler came to power, the Nazis came to power in Germany, that was his argument for why he should take off that area of Czechoslovakia and make it part of Germany, because he said, look, these are Germans. What does this have to do with Czechoslovakia? So you had these very large numbers of minority groups in a world in which nationality had increasingly come to be thought of in ethnic and in racial terms. So now, if you were one of these people in Czechoslovakia, let's say you're Czech, and you have these millions of Germans living with you, do you look at these people as your fellow citizens, or do you look at these people as potential enemies behind the line? Do you see them as, well, we'll assimilate these people to come to think of themselves as good Czechoslovaks? Or do you see them as precisely allowing for the kind of thing that the Nazis did in taking the Sudetenland away from Czechoslovakia? Being aware essentially of this feeling about the minorities as being fundamentally outsiders rather than citizens, the predecessor to the United Nations, which was called the League of Nations, that came into being after the First World War, and its goal was essentially to create the kind of cooperation between nationalities that would prevent another war like World War I. They said, okay, to all of these new nation states that had been created after the First World War, they said, we will recognize your sovereignty. We will recognize you as new nation states, but you have to promise to protect your minorities. You have to allow them, for example, to be able to have their own culture, speak their own language, etc. They created a system of minority rights. On the face of it, you would think, well, what's so bad about that, right? We want to make sure that minorities are actually protected. Hannah Arendt, though, argues that once you have this situation of minority rights, it's already clear that the story of human rights as the basis of citizenship and citizenship as the basis of nationality has completely broken down. Why? Because the whole idea of nationality as based on citizenship was that this is how everybody was supposed to have human rights, right? You become a citizen, and through that, you basically have human rights through your own state. But for the minorities, an international body has to actually come in to, in a sense, protect them from their own nationality. This just shows you that citizenship, based on presumably human rights, no longer provides any kind of protection. It doesn't actually make human rights real any longer. In fact, Hannah Arendt argues that doing this, an international body of people coming to try to create special rights for minorities, what it really does is it just shows how much these people are outsiders within their own countries, and it sets in process a whole other development, which is growing denationalization. If in the 19th century the focus had been increasingly on trying to integrate people through citizenship, by the end of the night, by the First World War, the focus turned to how do we get rid of the wrong kind of people, right? If the Jews are the wrong kind of people in Nazi Germany, then we need to pass laws to make sure that we get rid of these people who don't belong here. The Soviet Union denationalized very large numbers of Russians who were seen as being members of the wrong class, right? In fact, all European states start to pass denationalization laws. Instead of focusing on integrating people, they focus on excluding people, getting rid of the people who are seen as the wrong kind of people. And that is how we end up with stateless refugees. Stateless refugees like Arendt herself, right? And the situation of stateless refugees, now to come to the conclusions of this talk, for Arendt, perfectly shows what is wrong with the idea of universal human rights. She does this by talking about how the situation of the stateless is actually a lot worse than the situation of criminals, right? If you're a stateless refugee, you end up in a country, very often you're going to be put, the laws of citizenship in that country don't apply to you. So you're basically ruled by the police, usually in a mass, in a concentration camp, right? If you commit a crime, she argues, your situation actually gets better. Why? Because a criminal, based on what he or she does, now has the rights of citizenship applied to them. They can call a lawyer. They will be treated like all other citizens because of the crime that they've committed. Whereas for stateless refugees, they are treated as a mass of people to whom things happen regardless of what it is that they themselves have done. What they've done, what a Jewish person had done after the Nazis basically pushed them outside of the state, is irrelevant. It's just that they happen to be the wrong kind of person who've ended up in a situation where they are now outside of the law. So what then, according to Arendt, is dangerous about the idea that we have rights on the basis of our humanity? Why are human rights more a sign of dehumanization rather than a way of preventing dehumanization? Arendt argues, look at the situation of these stateless refugees. They don't have citizenship. Their identity has been taken away from them. They are basically ruled by the police in a concentration camp somewhere. What do they have left? In fact, all that they have left are their human rights. But the fact that they only have their human rights left shows that they are completely dehumanized, right? And that's, for her, is what's wrong with the idea of human rights. What's wrong with it for her is that human rights presume that we have rights simply because we are human beings. But if we end up being just human beings, which is what precisely happens to stateless refugees, then we're going to lose everything. We're going to lose all rights, actually, right? So that's why, for her, the idea of human rights is dangerous, because it doesn't understand how rights actually work. And Arendt's argument is that rights actually work through belonging to a community. They work because we do something. It's not that they exist because we are all human beings. For Arendt argues, we're all very, very different from each other, actually. We're not, as human beings, the same in any sense. We do something. We undertake some kind of political action, and that creates community, and that creates equality through creating rights, right? So instead of thinking that we have rights irrespective of our identity, irrespective of our community, Arendt's argument is that we have rights only to the extent that we undertake political action to try to create a community and a common identity, right? So for her, the fundamental problem is not about how do we make human rights real. the fundamental problem for Arendt is, how do we define community? How do we define identity, right, in society? And this is where I'm going to conclude. This is why she says it's essentially her notion of the creation of identity is a political conception, right? Instead of thinking rights are there and politics are based on human rights, she argues, no, it's only that we undertake political action that actually rights are created that would not, and equality is created that would not be there beforehand. How does our experience of rights in the pandemic demonstrate Arendt's contention that fundamentally our rights are based on the way in which we define belonging and community? And I'm going to say this very, very quickly, but I think simply looking what has happened in our experience of the pandemic shows you that it's because of the way that we've actually defined belonging and community in our societies that we have reacted in the ways that we have. If, for example, we had a group of stateless refugees, if you do a thought experiment and think only these people would have, for example, been subject to a virus rampaging potentially through our society, would we have shut down our societies because some percentage of stateless refugees might have actually been impacted by it? Probably not. The reason why we shut down our societies is because we had a notion of who belongs to our community, the vulnerable, our parents, our grandparents, right? And it's in that sense that we had the idea that we have to, all of our rights basically are equally connected to the extent that some members of our community are also impacted, right? And so this is why my argument is that what the pandemic and what has happened in it, what it can show us is that our focus should really be on how do we define community, belonging, identity in our societies, rather than the presumption that everybody has human rights and our development over time hopefully will make that more and more real for the people who don't have it. Okay, I know I've gone very, very long, so I'm gonna stop there. If anybody has questions, you can write it down, you can say it, or if not, I will happily let you go. I know I've taken a lot of your time and attention, okay? So if you have a question, please unmute yourself and ask it, or you can, I know some people are writing it in the chat, so. Okay, thank you guys. Thanks, Rakina, thanks, Gabriella. Thanks, guys, I appreciate it. Thanks for being here, and thanks for listening to a very, very long talk. Let me see. Oh, thank you, Regina. You're always very kind. Okay, okay, great. So if nobody has questions, I think, let's see. Othman, can you give us one or two thinkers that would express an opposite point of view in order to contrast opinions? Sure. Probably the great thinker, as opposed to Arendt, who really try to think about the direction of world history if rights are thought of in universal and human terms, and try to tell a story about humanity moving forward ultimately together, is Immanuel Kant. And that to some extent is a person that Hannah Arendt is arguing against and arguing with in her work, right? And Kant had a whole story about how our growing development over time, the more we learn, and his whole philosophy was based on the idea that human beings are capable of learning, And if you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you can see it basically explains the coming of the Universal Declaration in terms of a process of human learning, right? Kant argues, because we can learn over time, we will develop. The more we develop, the more we'll think in universal human terms, the more we'll actually move beyond violence actually altogether in our relationships, because we'll see that overcoming violence actually is the most productive way of doing things. And so we'll move towards essentially what he called perpetual peace. So Kant is a person who is focused on how do we think in more and more human terms in human history. And that's the person I would pair off against Arendt. There are many other thinkers, especially in the 19th century, the people who believe in development as the answer to everything, including Kant, who see politics as the problem, right? And I think that's another aspect that I didn't talk about too much, but so often in our world, we think about politics as the problem. You know, our development is supposed to take us beyond the politicians and all the harm that they cause. And Hannah Arendt's perspective is to say, no, it's not that politics belongs to the politicians, it's that politics is our capacity for human action. So those are some ways to talk about other thinkers who differ from Kant and who focus actually on human development as a way in which we realize our common humanity and the rights that belong to it. Any other questions? Okay. If not, I think I will say goodbye. I'll thank all of you. If anybody does have questions, please let me know. I'll wait one more minute. Okay, everybody, I'll say goodbye then. Thank you so much. Take care.